Osten schweigt. Aber er schläft nicht.
Wir sind bereit, Herr.
The cold was a living thing. It bit at the flesh, it gnawed at the bone. A relentless frozen misery that settled over the plains of Hungary in the spring of 1241. But for Prince Henry II of Silesia, Duke of Poland, and the flower of Europe,
Let these Tartar demons come.
Milanese plate and chainmail, they bore lances of seasoned ash, and their hearts burned with the fire of righteous certainty. They were the mailed fist of Christendom, and they were waiting for the devil's horde. One of Henry's knights, a German crusader named Otto, later wrote in a letter, "We have assembled a force such as has not been seen since the time of Charlemagne. The Teutonic Knights are here, the Templars, the Hospitallers, the finest of Poland and Moravia. Let these Tartar demons come. They will break upon our steel like water upon a rock." The Tartar demons were, of course, the Mongols. A little over a year earlier they had erupted from the eastern steppes, a storm of dust and hoofbeats that shattered the kingdoms of Rus. Their reputation preceded them, a whispered litany of horrors, that they were subhuman, that they drank the blood of their horses, that they fought with the aid of dark sorcery. But Prince Henry, like so many European commanders, believed this was just the superstition of defeated, lesser men. He did not understand that he was not facing a barbarian rabble. He was facing the most sophisticated, disciplined and ruthless military machine the world had yet seen, and it was led by a general who was about to execute a masterclass in deception, terror and annihilation. His name was Subutai. An old man now, by the standards of the time, in his 60s, he was the strategic genius behind Genghis Khan's greatest victories. He saw war not as a contest of honor, but as a science, and the army gathering at Liegnitz was his next experiment. This is the story of the Battle of Liegnitz. Not just a battle, but a systematic deconstruction of an entire way of war. It was the day the European knight, the undisputed master of the battlefield for centuries, met his match and was utterly destroyed. This is how the Mongols, against overwhelming odds, annihilated a force of 100,000 European knights and soldiers in just 3 days. To understand what happened at Liegnitz, you must first understand the instrument Subutai wielded. The Mongol army was a paradox. To their enemies, they appeared as a chaotic, undisciplined swarm. In reality, they were a perfectly tuned instrument of death, built for speed, communication and coordinated slaughter. Their power was built on the back of the Mongol horse. These were not the massive destriers of Europe, but small, shaggy, incredibly tough ponies. They could survive on forage alone, travel vast distances, and endure hardships that would kill a European warhorse. Every Mongol warrior had a string of these ponies, often 3 or 4, allowing him to switch mounts and maintain a relentless pace for days on end. A Mongol army could move over 100 miles in a day, a speed that was simply incomprehensible to their adversaries. Their primary weapon was the composite bow. This was not a simple longbow. It was a masterpiece of engineering, crafted from layers of sinew, horn and wood, laminated together and cured for years. It was a recurve bow, small enough to be fired from horseback, yet with a draw weight and range that eclipsed almost every other bow on earth. A trained Mongol archer could accurately hit a man-sized target at over 200 yards, and his arrows could punch through the chainmail of a European knight at 100 yards. They carried different arrowheads for different tasks, wide, slashing heads for unarmored infantry and horses, and narrow, armor-piercing bodkin points for knights. Their tactics were an extension of their mobility and firepower. They never, ever met a heavy charge head-on. Their doctrine was based on the feigned retreat. A small unit would engage the enemy, unleash a storm of arrows, and then appear to break and flee in panic. To a European knight, this was an irresistible sight. It was the signal to charge, to pursue, to break formation and run down the fleeing cowards. But it was a trap. The fleeing Mongols were not running away. They were leading their pursuers into a killing zone. As the enemy charge stretched out, becoming disordered and exhausted, the Mongols would turn in their saddles, a technique known as the Parthian shot, and continue to pour arrows into the pursuing force. They were like matadors, exhausting and bleeding the bull. Then, once the enemy was completely strung out and disorganized, the trap would spring shut. Fresh Mongol cavalry held in reserve would sweep in from the flanks and rear, surrounding the enemy completely. The Mongols called this tactic the Crow Swarm. To those caught inside, it was hell on earth. This was the army that Subutai brought to the gates of Europe. His plan was audacious. He would lead a massive raid into Hungary, while another smaller force under the command of Baidar and Kaydan would swing north into Poland. Their job was not conquest, but diversion. They were to wreak as much havoc as possible, drawing any potential relief forces away from the main Hungarian army under King Bela IV. Baidar and Kaydan's 3 tumens, roughly 30,000 men, swept into Poland like a prairie fire. They sacked Krakow, sending a pillar of black smoke into the sky as a grim signal of their passage. The Polish dukes scrambled to respond. They did exactly what Subutai had hoped they would do. They gathered their armies and moved to intercept this northern threat, believing it to be the main Mongol invasion force. They were walking into a carefully laid snare. Prince Henry, gathering his forces at Liegnitz, was the anvil, or so he thought. In reality, he was the prey. The army Prince Henry assembled was a kaleidoscope of medieval European power. At its core were the knightly elites, men encased in steel from head to toe, riding horses bred for size and power. Their doctrine was simple, brutal, and had won them countless victories: the mass charge. A wall of men and horse lances couched, smashing into the enemy line and shattering it through. Sheer, overwhelming force and momentum. Alongside Henry's own Silesian knights were the feudal levies of Poland. Brave, but poorly equipped and trained. There were volunteers from Moravia, and most formidably, a contingent of the Teutonic Knights. These were the warrior monks of the Crusades, the special forces of their day, fanatical, disciplined, and utterly fearless. A French Templar who had joined the force wrote, "The air is thick with the clank of steel and the murmur of prayers. We have confessed our sins. We are ready to meet God or these heathens, whichever he wills." The numbers are debated by historians, but modern estimates suggest Henry commanded a force of between 25,000 and 40,000 men. The larger, more dramatic chronicle numbers of 100,000 or more likely refer to the total number of European forces across the region, but the army at Liegnitz was still a formidable host, one of the largest assembled in 13th century Europe. They were confident, almost arrogantly so. They outnumbered the Mongols, they were heavier, and they fought for God. What they lacked was unity of command. Prince Henry was the nominal leader, but the Teutonic Knights, the Polish nobles, and the other contingents all had their own commanders, their own pride, their own ideas. This was an army of allies, not a single unified instrument. Meanwhile, the Mongols under Baidar and Kaydan were watching. Their scouts, the Zherke, were the eyes and ears of the army. Mounted on the fastest horses, they moved like ghosts through the forests and fields, counting every man, every banner in Henry's camp. They noted the terrain, the routes of approach, the location of fords. They knew Henry's army better than he did himself. Baidar and Kaydan had no intention of fighting a pitched battle against this heavy force. Their plan was to lure them out, to draw them away from the fortified town of Liegnitz and into open ground where their mobility and tactics could be brought to bear. They began by sending small raiding parties to harass Henry's outposts, to burn villages in sight of his camp, to taunt him. The tension in the Christian camp was palpable. A young Polish knight, Władysław, wrote in his diary the night before the battle, "The men are restless. The stories of the Mongols' cruelty spread through the camp like a plague. Some say they are not men at all, but beasts who feast on the dead. The Duke has ordered a great mass to be said at dawn. We will ride out and put an end to these whispers." Prince Henry took the bait. On the morning of April 9th, 1241, he gave the order. His army would march out and bring the Mongols to battle. He was confident that God was on his side. He did not know that Subutai's plan was unfolding with clockwork precision. The field chosen by the Mongols was a wide open plain, perfect for cavalry. As the European army marched out, they formed up in their traditional battle order. The first wave was a mix of levies and infantry from the town of Liegnitz. The second wave was the main force of Polish and Moravian knights. Prince Henry held the third wave, his own Silesian knights and the elite Teutonic Knights in reserve. Banners fluttered in the chill air. Crosses and heraldic beasts promised protection and victory. Across the field, the Mongol army arrayed itself. It must have been a strange and unsettling sight for the Europeans. There were no neat, orderly blocks of men. Instead, the Mongols formed into wide, loose lines, their small, shaggy horses moving with a skittish energy. They made no sound. No battle cries, no blaring trumpets, just an eerie, disciplined silence. Then the Mongols began to advance, not at a charge but at a steady trot. As they came within range, the sky suddenly darkened. A cloud of arrows arched high into the air, falling with a deadly hiss into the ranks of the European first wave. The range was staggering. The European crossbowmen, with their slower rate of fire and shorter range, were utterly outmatched. Men and horses fell screaming, the armor-piercing arrows finding gaps in visors and mail. The European commanders, enraged by this long-range slaughter, gave the order they had been waiting for. The first wave of Polish knights lowered their lances and charged. The ground shook as thousands of tons of men and steel began to move, building up to an irresistible momentum, and the Mongols broke. It was a beautiful, terrifying, perfectly executed feigned retreat. The entire Mongol line seemed to dissolve into chaos, turning their horses and fleeing back across the plain. To the Polish knights, it was confirmation of all their beliefs. The Mongols were cowards, unable to stand before the charge of Christian chivalry. They roared in triumph and spurred their horses on, their formations stretching, breaking apart as faster knights surged ahead, consumed by the bloodlust of the chase. They had taken the bait. The Polish charge plunged headlong into the Mongol trap. The fleeing Mongols did not run blindly. They controlled their retreat, staying just ahead of the lumbering European knights. And, as they rode, they performed their signature move. They turned in their saddles, a fluid, practiced motion, and continued to fire their bows backwards. The air was filled with the whir of arrows. The Polish knights, their armor protecting them from a direct frontal assault, were now being hit in their more vulnerable sides and backs. Horses, less protected than their riders, went down in screaming heaps, tripping those behind them. The charge lost its cohesion, becoming a confused, tangled mess of fallen men and panicked animals. This was the moment Baidar and Kaidan had been waiting for. From concealed positions on the flanks, fresh Mongol Tumens swept forward. They did not charge to engage in melee. Instead, they rode in wide, encircling arcs, like a lasso tightening around a steer. They poured a continuous, disciplined fire into the flanks and rear of the now isolated Polish first wave. The crow swarm was forming. A Mongol chronicler later wrote of the tactic, "It is like hunting. First, you frighten the animal and make it run. Then, you guide it where you want it to go. Then, you close the circle and there is no escape." Back with the main European force, Prince Henry watched in horror. The triumphant charge had turned into a slaughter. His first wave was being systematically cut to pieces before his eyes, and he could do nothing to help them. The trap was not yet sprung on him, but he could feel its jaws closing. The destruction of the first wave was total. Few, if any, of the Polish knights escaped the encirclement. The field was littered with the dead and dying. But for Prince Henry, the battle was not yet lost. He still had his second wave, and most importantly, his fresh, untouched reserve, the Silesian Knights and the Teutonic Knights. These were his best troops. He believed a decisive, concentrated charge by this heavy fist could still punch through the Mongol army and win the day. He gave the order. The Teutonic Knights, their white mantles with the black cross a stark symbol of defiance, led the way. They were a terrifying sight, a wall of faith and steel. They began their charge, a slow trot building to a canter, then a full, earth-shattering gallop. They aimed for what they perceived as the center of the Mongol line, a large contingent under a distinctive banner. This was the second act of the Mongol deception. As the Teutonic Knights thundered forward, something inexplicable happened. A dense, choking cloud of smoke and fog began to roll across the battlefield. The chronicles describe it as a strange, artificial smoke, a stinking vapor that blinded the Europeans and sowed panic and confusion. Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it a freak weather event, or was it a deliberate Mongol tactic? The Mongols were known to use smoke screens in battle, creating them by setting damp grass or other materials on fire. It is entirely plausible that this was a planned part of Subutais' intricate battle plan. Whatever its origin, the effect was devastating. The charging knights were blinded. They lost all sense of direction and cohesion. The unified charge broke apart into small, disoriented groups. At that moment, the Mongols unleashed their final, terrifying weapon. It was a weapon the Europeans had never seen, never imagined. The chroniclers called it a dragon. They described a terrifying roar, a flash of fire, and a projectile that flew through the air, leaving a trail of smoke. It struck the tightly packed ranks of the knights, and where it landed, it erupted in a storm of fire, noise, and flying metal. Men and horses were torn apart. The sound alone was enough to drive the already panicked horses mad with terror. This was not a dragon. It was one of the earliest uses of gunpowder weapons in European warfare. The Mongols had acquired this technology from the Chinese. They were using early grenades, fire lances, or perhaps even a primitive form of rocket. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Against an enemy already confused by smoke and the shock of the feigned retreat, the effect was catastrophic. It confirmed their deepest fears, that they were not fighting men, but demons wielding the very fires of hell. The charge of the Teutonic Knights and Henry's reserve disintegrated. It did not break, it dissolved into a screaming, panicked mob. There was no formation left to command, no battle line to hold. It was every man for himself. Now the Mongols switched tactics. The archers fell back and the heavy lancers came forward. These were not the European-style knights, but still highly mobile cavalry, armed with lances and sabres. Their job was the mopping up. They swept through the scattered, demoralized groups of European knights, cutting them down with ruthless efficiency. The Mongols had a simple rule in battle: show no mercy to a defeated enemy. A fleeing enemy could regroup and fight again. A dead enemy could not. The battle became a massacre. Prince Henry, seeing his army being wiped out, attempted to flee the field with a small guard of his most loyal knights. But the Mongol encirclement was complete. There was no escape. He was run down, pulled from his horse and killed. The Mongols, in a final act of psychological terror, are said to have cut off his head and carried it on a spear as they paraded before the walls of Liegnitz. The city, however, they did not take. They had achieved their objective. The army of relief was destroyed. There was nothing left between them and the heart of Europe. And then, as suddenly as they had come, they turned and vanished back to the east. The field at Liegnitz was a charnel house. The dead were piled high. The chronicles speak of the Mongols cutting off an ear from every slain soldier, filling 9 large sacks with their grisly trophies. The true number of European dead will never be known, but it was catastrophic. The flower of Polish and Silesian chivalry, the military orders, the feudal levies, all were gone. The military power of the region was shattered for a generation. A monk from a nearby monastery who ventured onto the field days later wrote, "The silence was the most terrible thing. No birds sang. The only sound was the buzzing of flies, so thick in the air you could taste them. The field was a carpet of the dead, men and horses intertwined in a final grotesque embrace. The stench of death hung over the land for miles. We have looked into the face of the apocalypse, and it is a Tartar face." Just 2 days later, on April 11th, 1241, the main Mongol army under Subutai proved this was no fluke. They met and annihilated the massive army of King Bela IV of Hungary at the Battle of Mohi, using similar tactics of feigned retreat, encirclement, and the devastating use of gunpowder and siege engines. In 3 days, the 2 most powerful armies in Central Europe had ceased to exist. Europe lay naked and terrified. There was nothing to stop the Mongols from marching to the Atlantic. But then, fate intervened. Back in Mongolia, the great Khan Ogedi, son of Genghis, had died. By Mongol law, all princes and generals were required to return to the capital to elect a new Khan. The Mongol tide, which had reached its high water mark at Liegnitz and Mohi, receded as quickly as it had come. The salvation of Europe came not from a battlefield victory, but from politics half a world away. The legacy of Liegnitz was profound. It was a military revolution. It demonstrated, in the most brutal terms possible, that the era of the undisputed dominance of the heavily armored knight was over. A new way of war had arrived, one based on speed, intelligence, discipline, and combined arms. It would take Europe centuries to fully learn these lessons, but the shockwave from that field in Silesia reverberated through history. The Battle of Liegnitz was more than just a clash of armies. It was a clash of worlds, of philosophies, of technologies. It was the day the past fought the future, and the future won. It was the day 100,000 knights learned, in just 3 days, that courage and steel were no match for genius, discipline, and the relentless, terrifying science of war perfected by the Mongol Empire.